Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Roxana Robinson. Roxana Robinson is a distinguished prize-winning novelist and biographer. She's also president of the Authors Guild, the nation's oldest and largest professional organization for writers. Giving the term cyber war new meaning, the Authors Guild has for the past decade been embroiled in a high-stakes copyright infringement suit against Google. The casus belli is Google's library and books projects, in which Google scans without the author's approval tens of millions of books and establishes a publicly available search function so that the reader can read words, phrases, or even whole sentences extracted from copyright material and never buy the book. Google won the case in the lower federal courts with its fair use defense. But the lawsuit has now reached the doorstep of the Supreme Court of the United States, where Google stands to lose billions of dollars if the Authors Guild prevails. Roxana Robinson, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Now, tell me about this Authors Guild of which you were the distinguished president. How old is it? And tell me a little bit about its background and history.
The Authors Guild was founded just about 100 years ago, and it has a very distinguished roster of members. One of its early members was Ida Tarbell, who brought about almost single-handedly the downfall of Standard Oil, making claims that it was too large and too domineering to be a healthy part of the economy, and she and her fellow writers went after it. So we have a history of activist members, and we have always taken very strong positions on issues that affect writers, that affect free speech, and that affect the literary community of this country.
Now, the first president was a man named Winston Churchill, but it wasn't the Winston Churchill, it was another Winston Churchill. What can you tell us about him?
It was not the Winston Churchill that we're all thinking of. We have a lot of journalists, and I think he was a journalist.
And a vice president, one of the first vice presidents was Theodore Roosevelt, who signed the Copyright Act of 1909 before he left office.
That's right. That's right.
And he was New York City Police Commissioner, and then he winds up as president and first vice president of the Authors Guild.
That's right.
Now, is protection of copyright works central to your mission?
Absolutely. It's a really important issue, particularly nowadays when we see the spreading of the idea that information wants to be free without the use of the second half of that sentence, which is that information wants to be expensive as well. So there is an increasing sense in the public consciousness that writing should be free, which is directly opposed to the idea that writers, like plumbers, like politicians, like everyone else in the world, should be paid for their work. So writers right now are struggling, and we think copyright is a really important issue, and it's one that we want to draw the public attention to.
Well, their right to be paid for their work is really embedded in the Constitution of the United States, isn't it? Which says that one of the powers of Congress is to enact copyright laws. And Congress proceeded to do just that.
Yeah, it's written into the Constitution because the founders recognized the fact that it was important to have writers who were economically supported by the community so that their work would be an incentive, the compensation would be an incentive for them to continue contributing to the intellectual discourse of the country. We have to have writers in a democracy. It's an essential part of who we are.
But it's also, the purpose of the copyright laws is to benefit the public, because by giving writers an incentive, the writers disseminate information, and the information is of great intellectual value to the public.
Exactly.
Now, can you tell us about some of the major advocacy issues that you're engaged in on behalf of your organization?
Well, we've done a lot of things recently, and the one that's most visible right now is Google, as you mentioned. We also took a position a year ago on the situation in which Amazon and Hachette were facing off against each other, and Amazon essentially punished the writers for being part of Hachette. And so we took a position on that and asked Amazon not to punish writers. We're also...
Did they do it? And they refrained from punishing writers?
They stopped doing the punitive things that they had done, which was remove the pre-order buttons from a lot of Hachette authors. They did complicated practices. So if I went to look at your book on Amazon...
That's the mother court. Let's have a plug. Because I'm going to plug your book very soon.
Wonderful book. So if I went to look at your book and it had just been published by Amazon, Amazon would show me another book on the same subject that was less expensive and suggest that I buy that instead. So they were taking a lot of strong positions on Hachette authors, which we thought was completely unfair because Hachette authors had no power in this situation. So we took a position on that. We're taking a strong position against Google. We're also asking that certain things be changed in the Copyright Office in Washington. We do a lot of advocacy work on behalf of writers.
And what about this disturbing tendency of publishers to try to shift to the writer the expense of marketing his or her book?
Yeah, publishing is changing radically, as is everything else. And so what publishers are doing now is, I think because publishers were kind of caught off balance when the digital world grew so enormously fast and powerfully. And so they started looking at writers and saying, well, you know how to blog, you know how to make a website, we can't do that for you. We want you to get involved in the promotion of your book. And to a certain extent, that's fair, but it's not fair for the publishers to expect the writers to do so very much. And it's very time-consuming, and it's distracting, and it takes time away from the writer's ability to create their real work, which is the writing. So asking writers to put so much time and energy into promotion when the publishers actually hire professional promoters seems a misdirection of efforts.
It's just shifting the cost to the writer. So the writer might have to hire a publicist and pay for it.
So we also ask publishers to reconsider the relationship between them and writers, and we've had a Fair Contracts initiative in which we're examining different aspects of contracts. Many of them are just boilerplate, and they're contracts that have been in place for a long time. We're asking them to re-examine those terms and to shift the contracts so that writers get a better shake.
Now, you've pushed back against publishers' suggestions that authors lend themselves to having dinner at a restaurant with people who might be interested in the book, or going on book tours and doing things for which authors aren't particularly well suited.
Yeah, I wrote a piece about that because I saw online a suggestion by a publishing person who said that writers should be creative and they should come up with strange ideas in which to make money and to make the book more popular. And one of them was to go to a local restaurant and ask the restaurant to give space and to find 10 people who would pay $200 each to come and have a dinner there at the restaurant and hear the writer read from the book. It's something that writers are absolutely fundamentally unsuited to set up. It's hard enough to ask a bookstore to stock your book, let alone to go to a restaurant owner and ask him to donate an evening's worth of food and drink. And it's hard to find people and ask them to spend $200 to come and listen to you talk. It's just absolutely not the right way to ask writers to spend their time.
So what kind of marketing should writers be doing for their books? None, or is some of it appropriate?
Well, I think it's going to depend on the writer and the publisher and the book. And some writers have fun doing it, and some writers have blogs or they have Facebook pages and they have fun delivering information. But I think to ask writers to be the person to try to make the contacts and set up events is very demanding on writers. And it's not only time consuming, it sort of drains your soul to have to do things like that. So I think that kind of logistical scene setting should be done by publishers, and ask the writers to do what they do best, which is whatever it is. Writers have different methods.
Now, you wrote a marvelous novel called Sparta. Absolutely loved the book. How much soul draining did you do in order to market it?
Well, with that, I was lucky in some ways. I was very lucky because I got some wonderful response from the military community itself. So I was invited to talk, and I was given an award by the Marine Heritage Foundation. So I was invited by the military to become involved in their world. So that was wonderful. That was not at all soul draining. That was life enhancing.
Let's move along to the suit with Google. It's lasted 10 years. And you're now in the Supreme Court of the United States. Can you tell us what Google is doing or has done that is not in the best interests of writers?
So what Google did was really interesting. About a little over 10 years ago, it went to a group of major research libraries, and it gave them a proposition, and that was that Google would take control of their entire collection of books, scan each book digitally, keep a copy for themselves, and give a copy of the digital books to the libraries. Now, this was brilliant. It's a really brilliant move for a high-tech company to do. And it gave them access to an enormous database of linguistic material and also intellectual property. The thing was that they didn't ask permission of the writers, and this is many of these books are in copyright. So when
copyright lasts how long?
It differs.
Almost 100. It differs, but it's almost 100 years.
It can be extended, yeah. So what they did was take material that didn't belong to them for their own purposes, and now they are using that. So they've created Google Books, and they also have search engines. So if I type into Google, "all happy families are alike," I will immediately be told by Google that that's the first sentence of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. They can tell me that so quickly because they have that whole book in their database. They don't allow me to read the whole book, but they will allow me to engage with it through their search engine. So where the authors and Google differ is on the way they are allowed to use our material without compensation and without permission. Google's claim is that this is fair use because they don't show the entire book. Our claim is, since they have taken the entire book and since they use it for purposes that are hidden to us, we don't see how they have organized it so that they have this vast treasure house of linguistic data. So they use it for things just like that. So I can type that phrase in, they tell me where it is. That draws traffic to their site.
And Google is a profit-making organization.
It is an extremely profitable organization.
Big profits. Now, how do they get their profits? Does it depend on traffic? Does it depend on views?
Google makes its money from advertising revenues, and that is dependent on traffic. And Google is one of the most powerful search engines in the world. And so the fact of their having this enormous database drives traffic. I will go there, and you will go there to look things up. We all do. It's a wonderful resource. But they are standing on the backs of people who have contributed that content without being asked, without being compensated. Now, one of the definitions of fair use, which is what Google is using as its reason for being allowed to do this, one of the definitions revolves around commercial use. And this is nothing if not commercial. So that Google had, in 2011, Google's advertising revenues were $36.5 billion.
$billion. So the more the commercial purpose, the greater the commercial purpose, the law is, the less the fair use. That's in the statute, it seems. All right, but you're not taking the position at the Authors Guild that Google should be prohibited from doing this. You're just saying they should pay the authors for doing it.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful service. We all use it. It's part of the new world that we've been given. It's an electronic deep space. It's wonderful to have it. It's just that since they are using other people's content, they should be compensating the owners of that content.
But it does tend to enhance Google's monopoly because they're getting more traffic than the other search sites. I mean, Yahoo doesn't scan books, and nor do other search engines that are in competition with Google.
As far as I know, it's absolutely the supreme search engine. So everyone uses it, and it's very useful for a research tool.
Now, Google argues that it doesn't scan to make these books available to the searcher. It only makes the books more readily searchable, and without their search engine, you couldn't scan all these books in a lifetime. You couldn't read them all and extract those things that were of interest to you. Is there anything to that argument?
I think it's an argument against Google's position, actually. The fact that you couldn't read all those books in a lifetime means that all you can do, if you're interested in doing a long-term historical research project, Google is the perfect search engine to do that kind of research. So it enables you to read 500 years worth of books that deal with God. And so Google will tell you how many books deal with that subject, and if you look in the book, it will tell you how many times the word is used. Often, if you're a student, this is the tool you use. It's like an index card library catalog. So it tells you what the books are that you need to look at, and it allows you to look inside of them for the term that you are interested in. And so in many cases, for nonfiction books, for a researcher, it eliminates the need to get that book. It eliminates the need to buy it or to look at it in a library because you've already done all the research that you needed to do through Google.
So it would not, for example, they don't do it for a dictionary or a cookbook, do they?
They don't, because
they have some self-imposed limitations.
Yes, they do.
Because obviously, if they did it for a dictionary and you wanted a word, you'd go there and you wouldn't have to buy the dictionary.
Exactly.
But they do it for other books that are less specific in terms of the information that they give.
Well, lots of nonfiction books depend on, they contain facts and also ideas and theories. So the theory would be that Lincoln was a racist or he was not a racist. So you're going to get a book that delivers that theory. And Google will give you, if you ask for a word in that book, it will give you the places where that word is used so that you can assess that book and you don't need to buy it.
Now, you've had kind of a rocky road through the courts in the course of this 10-year litigation because both the district court and now the Second Circuit Court of Appeals have ruled against you, and the Second Circuit ruled against you unanimously, a decision by Pierre Laval, a great judge sitting in that circuit and who is an expert in copyright law, has written opinions and law review articles and lectured on the subject. He applied the factors that are in the Copyright Act and said this was fair use. Now, where does the Authors Guild think he went off the track?
We think that fair use, as you mentioned, we think that fair use requires the usage that the work is put to not to be commercial. And this is transparently commercial. Moreover, Google is not only incredibly rich, but authors are incredibly poor. So we did a survey recently that showed that the majority of authors who responded to our survey would be below the poverty level if they were living off their writing incomes. So you have a severe inequity between the two parties. And Google is making billions of dollars a year on ads that are drawn because of this content. So we think fair use in terms of commercial and non-commercial use is pretty straightforward. We also disagree with him on whether or not the use that Google puts these books to is transformative. And we feel that transformative use requires some kind of expressive content. It's not simply the replication of the work with a different vehicle. it would be to change the work in some way. So if I wrote a satire of your book, that would be transformative use, and I wouldn't have to ask you permission to use it.
May or may not be, but a parody certainly would be transformative. Something that seeks to demolish the work in some way, or be critical of the work in some way.
Or if I made your book into a poem, into an epic poem, that would be transformative.
But not if you made my book into a movie, or or you translated my book into French. That would be a derivative use to be protected by my copyright, wouldn't it?
Yes, you know, I'm not sure how copyright, I mean, if somebody wants to make a movie out of my book, they have to buy the book. On the other hand, there are cases in the court right now of people who've had movies made and they were not paid, so that becomes murky as well. But in this case, Google is not transforming the work at all. It's simply taking possession of the entire text and making it available in batches.
And do you see an economic effect on the writer because Google is doing what it's doing?
Well, we have seen a precipitous drop in writers' incomes over the last, we did a survey in 2009 and we just did one recently, which shows a terrible drop in income. So as I say, the majority of the writers that we survey would be below the poverty line if they were depending only on their income from writing. This isn't entirely due to Google. We're in an era when people do expect writers to write for nothing, and newspapers and magazines are seeing problems with this, and they're firing writers. But it's all based on this notion that writing should be free, and it can't be free. We can't ask writers to spend their time and their best efforts and their ideas on doing something that they won't get paid for. Google doesn't tell its software writers that they should work for free. So the idea of intellectual property is something that we believe in this country should be compensated.
Okay, so one of the plaintiffs in your lawsuit was the baseball player Jim Bouton, who wrote a terrific book called Ball 4. And Google Books offers what's called a snippet inside the book with regard to his book. What is a snippet?
Well, actually, the definition seems to have varied during this case. So it's become smaller. At one point, it was maybe a paragraph size. Now I think it's 3 lines. So again, it will only show you, and it depends on the book because publishers have made agreements with Google. So some books will give you much more full pages, and some books will only give you 3 lines and just show you where the word appears. So it's a sort of a moving target. It's not clear exactly how much they're willing to show, but they do show, they say they won't show more than 78% of the book, and that is shown in cut-up pieces. The snippet itself is quite small, but it's used...
And they will remove the snippet at the request of the author.
Yes, the author can opt out of this. But of course, Google is such a great location, nobody wants to opt out. They have been so successful that very few writers would want to remove themselves from this database.
With respect to your novel, Sparta, there's a preview function where I can read consecutive pages of the book and a number of chapters of the book. Certainly not the whole book, but I can preview the book on Google. Have you and your publisher given them permission to do that?
I don't know. I haven't asked my publisher about that. I think it's less of a problem with novels because really, if you like a novel, you will not feel, if you want to read the whole novel, you will not feel that it's sufficient to read what Google Books offers. It's more of a problem with nonfiction books where people mine the book for the information they need and then decide not to buy it.
And Google has imposed a certain blacklisting where 1 complete page out of every 10 is made unavailable and 1 snippet on each page is made unavailable, so that they're trying or straining to limit the amount of information they give out. But you say that's not enough.
Well, I just think that nowadays we all adjust to whatever the conditions are. So if you feel that you can page through a book and every 10th page is gone, you still feel that you have found out as much information as you need if you're doing a paper on whatever it is, divorce, and you find the majority of the references in that book, you may well feel that you have done all the research you need in that book. So they are giving you enough to do a certain amount of work. And we're talking about a lot of the books that are involved here are books that are going to be used for research. So this is a really important issue. Academics in particular are seeing their incomes plummet, and it plays a part in that.
So if I put in the search George Washington and false teeth, I may get enough hits to give me the information I want. I won't have to buy any book.
Exactly.
And I might get information from 3 or 4 books.
And you won't have to go to the library. And libraries used to be a very solid and supportive presence in the ecosystem. So they would buy the books that the writers wrote.
So I have a question for you, Roxana Robinson, because we have to wrap up. Are the Google book and library projects making fair use of authors' works, or are they going too far?
Well, we think that this is not fair use. We think that writers should be compensated because their work is central to Google Books. It's the core of it. And Google Books is making money, and the writers are not.
Can't play Hamlet without the ghost, and you can't give out information without a writer. So the writers really should reign supreme. Roxana Robinson, thank you so much for coming by. This has been wonderful. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best, and take care.